Thank you for introducing me, David. Ani Jesse Dijnikas, Wikum Kong Donjaba, Makwadodum, and Shnabakwe, and Down Miigwech. Hi, my name is Jesse, and as Dave introduced, I am currently at Mount Allison University, which is in New Brunswick, but I did grow up in Northern Ontario, and very happy to say I'm coming back. So thank you very much for being here today and for inviting me. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing in relation to climate change, more specifically connecting guardians in a changing world. So we're here talking today about climate change due to some of the great work that David and Chantal are doing. But as we know, the environment is really being impacted by an onslaught of different things. Climate change, a lot of anthropogenic or human impacts. We're seeing forestry impacts. We're seeing species decline at alarming rates. Some scientists are suggesting we're entering a sixth mass extinction. So we have a lot of things going on, making it so important to work together to address some of these issues. So today I'm going to talk about just some of the work that we have going on that's a collaborative project that aims to connect guardians or communities in a changing world where we're seeing all these massive environmental impacts. So I'm going to share with you a project that's being led by Magnetawan First Nation in partnership with myself at Mount Allison University, with Dr. Deb McGregor from York University and Adam Ford from University of British Columbia in Okanagan, among with many other partners. This is from a larger project we're doing, but specifically for one component, working with communities in Ontario, we wanted to connect guardians in a changing world to try to foster collaborations and prioritize important research, monitoring, management objectives. So last November, we had a workshop in Magnetawan First Nation where we invited communities in the Great Lakes region of Ontario. These are this map here showing the community members that we had participate in our workshop. So we invited one representative from the Lands Department, who then identified one elder and one youth to attend this workshop. So kind of the purpose was to connect guardians, connect communities, but also to identify what are people's major concerns with respect to some of these things impacting us today, to get everyone kind of aware of some of these major concerns. Now, as you can guess, there are a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of environmental impacts issues facing us today. So we had to kind of narrow down our workshop to two of the more important issues that were expressed by community members in the region through working with communities over many years and hearing concerns at conferences and so on. And those two areas of concern were climate change and herbicide use in forestry. So we actually did a workshop over 2 days, and each day took a different focus. But today I'm just going to be sharing with you the climate change component of day one. So climate change. So what we did for this workshop was we had the representative from the Lands Department, an elder and a youth, all come together. We broke up into sharing circles, and we had a facilitator for each sharing circle, so smaller groups, where we could discuss some of these major concerns, some impacts being seen on the land, and ways to move forward. So listening throughout the duration of this workshop to what everyone had to share, and coming up with major trends, major things that we found a lot of people talking about, and this is what you can see in the background here. So some of the topics of discussions, questions that we asked, I'll talk about now. So one was, what is your greatest climate change concern related to your community or way of life? So the answers that, the themes that people kind of talked about the most, I'm just going to move this over. So people talked about in terms of what was important in regards to climate change related to community and way of life, so understanding land is becoming more difficult and unpredictable. We had people saying you just can't read the land anymore, it's speaking a different language. Decreased opportunities to harvest wildlife and medicines. Climate change is affecting traditional and spiritual practices. So for example, it's too dry to do controlled burns anymore, so other things like that. There's limited capacity of communities to address climate change, and we need to identify where to allocate resources. So you see all these stickers here, these notes that we made. We actually asked participants to have, they had one sticker each, so it's a dot voting exercise, where people could then go up after we presented the common themes that people were discussing, could then go up and place one sticker on the thing they felt was most important. So this gives us a sense of where most of the concern was. So one of the biggest concerns was climate change affecting traditional and spiritual practices. So we had quite a, we actually recorded the discussions and got some excellent feedback. And so in particular to this question, one individual said, when I see species starting to disappear, I see my culture starting to disappear. And to me, that's like the worst thing that can happen. So often when academics, for example, talk about climate change, we often talk about the biophysical impacts of climate change. So how does climate change affect the environment, you know, species, soil, weather, and so on. But everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected, and we're not just, climate change is not just impacting the biophysical, but the people that rely on the biophysical, right? So the socio-cultural impacts as well. Another discussion point was, what is your greatest climate change concern in regards to the environment? So people talked about animal and plant distributions changing, animal and plant life cycles changing, water cycle and quality changing, biodiversity is shifting, or for example, animal populations are declining, and disease and parasites were changing. An individual said the climate change impacts to those animals and environment will actually impact our community and way of life. So once again, this was emphasized throughout the duration of the workshop, the importance of the interconnection with humans and the environment. Again, often in the academic world, we tend to separate the environment from humans, and in fact, we're all connected. And then finally, one of the other major points of discussion is, what is the most important climate change research direction for you? People talked about water quality and quantity, baseline animal and plant inventory and long-term monitoring, research and policies that include Indigenous and Western knowledge, risk assessment for communities, and ecosystem approaches as opposed to species approaches. So taking a holistic approach and understanding of the interconnectedness of the environment. Now, you can see most of these dot stickers were placed on research and policies that include Indigenous and Western knowledge. So a lot of people spoke to that. For example, people saying traditional knowledge is scientific knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is equally as valuable as Western science. The value of Indigenous knowledge isn't taken seriously by Western ways of knowing. Western science, it can contribute, but it's not the be-all, end-all. And science can complement our knowledge. And then one individual said, all of us, not just the elders, not just you, everybody, we all need to be working together. So that was really emphasized during the workshop, is that you know, we can better address some of these issues by all coming together, all working together, connecting with one another, and again, bringing together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. This was at sometimes a pretty, you know, it can be a rather depressing topic, talking about a lot of these environmental issues. And but one thing that really stood out was that there was hope. So one individual said that's one of the advantages of traditional knowledge, is that there is hope. So that was kind of emphasized throughout the workshop. So going back to policies and research that weave in Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, this is in line with a concept of two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing is a concept coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki or Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And essentially two-eyed seeing is just, you can better understand the world, the environment, or the world in general by seeing through two lenses. So one lens through Indigenous ways of knowing and perspective, and another lens through Western ways of knowing and perspective. And the idea is that these different ways of seeing the world can be complementary to one another, and can therefore help advance the way that you see the world, the way you understand the world, for example, environmental science or understanding climate change. So I was asked also to talk a little bit about some of the other work I'm doing with respect to taking a two-eyed seeing approach in relation to climate change. Most of the work in my lab does that. We look for ways to take a two-eyed seeing approach, or braiding together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing in ecological science. So I'll just talk a little bit about a moose project that I have going on. Maybe a lot of you are familiar with moose are starting to decline across North America. We're not really sure why, and everyone is kind of seeing this, including our Indigenous nations. A Cree Nation elder said the moose aren't calling back anymore from a workshop I attended, and that's kind of what we're hearing across the board, is that moose are starting to decline. Again, we're not really sure why, although we do have a pretty good understanding of things that impact moose. So for example, predation, so wolves, bears, people harvest moose. So, there could be some over harvesting happening, but it doesn't, probably not really making sense with all of a sudden, over harvesting happening. Humans can also impact moose in other ways as well. So through habitat alteration, for example. And then there's climate change. So climate change is impacting species across the world, directly and indirectly, including moose. So directly through things like thermal regulation, indirectly in a variety of ways, and I'm very confident that we have barely scratched the surface. One way that you've probably heard of climate change impacting moose is through parasites and disease. Specifically, the winter tick is getting a lot of attention in the media lately. So the winter tick is just this external parasite that jumps on the moose in the fall, feeds through the winter and engorges, and falls off in spring. So you can see on the bottom right there, someone with gloves pulling apart moose fur. So, and those are ticks embedded in the skin, and they get very, very big. So those big ticks sucking blood on moose can get very annoying. The picture of the moose on the bottom left, she's walking down a railway and she's missing a lot of her fur on her shoulder. Moose don't like ticks, and they try to rub them off throughout the winter, and in doing so, they lose a lot of fur. They can lose so much that they can be called ghost moose and look, completely devoid of hair. Now imagine being a moose in winter, and you have these ticks bugging you. You're rubbing off your fur. You're cold. It's minus 40 sometimes, and you have no winter coat. You're losing heat. Moose have to eat a lot to replenish that heat loss, to replenish that blood loss. There aren't a lot of great sources of food in winter for moose. So moose can actually die due to winter ticks from blood loss, starvation, hypothermia. I've actually seen this myself, and Frank touched on this during the last discussion you had. I just figured I'd elaborate on the story a little bit. So a couple winters ago in Ontario, in the Sudbury region, I used to go horseback riding on a trail in the bush. And I noticed moose tracks hanging around the trail, and it was a hard winter. A lot of snow, it was really cold, and I figured, that's just a good travel path for this moose. It's a nice packed down trail. And one day I was out alone, and I saw this moose right here, and he was sitting beside the trail, just a couple meters in the forest line. And I was like, what the heck is this moose doing here? Here I am riding this big stinky horse that's super noisy. This moose heard us coming. And it was at that point that moose looked at me. He put his head down, and he died. Right there in front of me. It's one of the saddest things I've ever seen, but being a biologist, I wanted to investigate. So I went over to that moose. It's hard to tell on this picture, but this is a young bull, and he was missing a lot of fur. He was covered in winter ticks, and he was very, very bony. Now I couldn't really confirm, but it looked like he had died due to starvation. So really sad, but what does this have to do with climate change? So winter ticks have been around for a long time. They have this relationship with moose, but the thought is that during that life cycle, so ticks will jump on the moose in fall, they'll feed over the winter, and they'll fall off in spring. Now, sometimes they fall off and they land on bare ground and they go to lay their eggs and the cycle continues. Sometimes when they fall off, they'll land on snow and it's not the best environment, so the cycle stops there. So in some regions, more and more, we're seeing these warmer, earlier springs, and more ticks are surviving. So the thought is that tick loads are increasing. I know scientists that have their undergraduate students working on projects counting tick loads on moose, and there can be up to 90,000 ticks on a moose. So quite enormous. But is this what's happening with moose? This is something that scientists are exploring, but could be a number of things. These are two images sent to me from community members from Big Tigong-Nishnawbeg in the moose project that we were doing. The one on the left is a moose covered in warts. This is something that happens to moose, but not something that had been seen before by community members. So perhaps there's a shift in prevalence of disease maybe associated with climate change. The moose on the right was a moose that was harvested at a moose hunt camp I attended. And the hunters came to me and said, "There's something wrong with this moose. You gotta come check it out." So I did, and sure enough, her eyes were whited over. It looked like she was blind. Her back end was very depleted, very skinny, muscle loss. You can see her hip bones sticking out there. And again, I didn't confirm, but these are symptoms typical of brain worm or meningeal worm. And this is another parasite. This is an internal parasite. Typically, white-tailed deer harbor this parasite, and it doesn't really affect them. But when white-tailed deer shed larvae in their scat, moose and other ungulates can accidentally ingest them, and it can be lethal to them, causing symptoms like we saw here. What's interesting, though, is this moose was in the boreal forests of Ontario, not a place where you typically see a lot of white-tailed deer. The thought is with climate change, though, is that as the environment warms up, its distributions of trees and plants and animals are shifting more north. And of course, with those animals, there are associated diseases. So through talking with elders and knowledge holders, a lot of individuals will say we're seeing a lot more deer around here. So it's likely that there's a variety of factors that are impacting moose associated with climate change, but we need to know more. We need to know what we need to focus on in order to help our moose. So this project we did with moose stemmed first when I was working with the Anishinaabeg Ontario Fisheries Resource Centre, and it was a partnership with Big Tigong-Nishnawbeg initially to develop monitoring tools to be able to monitor moose. So one of the first steps to researching and managing an animal is to be able to monitor them. So we worked with Big Tigong-Nishnawbeg as a pilot study to develop tools that could be adapted by any community in the Anishinaabeg Nation. We did fecal pellet transects, we did aerial survey training, and then we developed a moose monitoring app, which was most supported by the community and was of most interest. So basically, this is just an app that you can put on your phone or your tablet, where hunters or people going out specifically seeking moose can record the number of bulls, cows, calves seen per unit effort of time. So although that wouldn't give you a density of moose or a number of moose on the land, it would give users an index of population change. So the idea is, if you have hunters going out and normally, on average, they see about one moose in the first week of hunting. But through time, that takes longer and longer. And after a few years, it takes an entire month before someone sees a moose. So that's a very good indication that moose populations have declined. So it's a way to monitor change in population. What's really cool about this app is it allows for merging of tradition with technology. It allows that Western science aspect of monitoring moose populations, but also can infuse traditional knowledge. So for example, if a hunter were to go out and say, my grandfather used to take me here and always told me that he would see a moose within the first, week. And now I've been out here for 3 falls and I've never seen a moose in this area. Well, that's a good indication that the distribution has changed or the population has declined. So yeah, so this app was really really embraced by Big Tigong-Nishnawbeg. And the second part of this project was to understand factors related to moose decline. Again, I said, we do have some ideas of factors that are influencing moose, but there is a lot more we need to learn. And as far as I know, so far, no one has worked with Indigenous communities to gather, to bring knowledge to the forefront and those observations on the land to see what's going on with moose. So this kind of expanded our project and then partnered with Shawanaga First Nation and as well as Magnetawan First Nation. So yeah, so investigating factors related to moose decline. We visited each community and spoke with elders and hunters and knowledge holders, about, first of all, are you noticing declines in moose populations, or are they increasing or decreasing, staying the same? If decreasing, what factors do you know are, or do you think are related to moose decline? And how would that decline in moose impact you, your way of life, as well as the environment? So we're actually writing a report up on that now, but we did have some very good insights into things that previously maybe weren't considered, and will really help us guide our work, bring Indigenous knowledge through factors identified with the factors that Western science has seen, bring them together and try to interweave and understand those major factors that affected moose. Something that was very apparent through discussing with elders and knowledge holders, and kind of the theme of what we were seeing with the Connecting Guardians workshop. Juanita Starr, she's lands manager with Big Tagong Mishnabik, said a lot of people don't realize, most people just see moose as food, but it's not just food, it's more than food. It's creating a circle of being. You're getting the teaching aspects, you're getting the social aspects, you're getting the value of moose far greater than one person thinks. Moose are so important in ensuring ecological integrity, but also in ensuring cultural integrity. So again, that's where that interconnectedness component comes in. So with all of this work associated with my lab, we are doing lots of spin-off projects, having community members, knowledge holders, elders, knowledge shared, guide research, so that we can ensure we're doing research in a good way. Community-led research that builds capacity, that involves youth. So for example, one project we're doing is through that Connecting Guardians in a Changing World workshop. We really heard how important it was that we should be interweaving Indigenous and Western ways of knowing in our research and our policies. And now we're continuing that work, and we've kind of expanded to across Canada to talk to nations from across the country about, how can we do this? How can we equally value and give a platform to both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to engage in ecological research. So that's ongoing now. So in talking about research in a good way, I'd just like to mention, this is a braid of sweetgrass, and I like to mention the relationship when thinking about research in a good way. In thinking of a braid, braid usually has 3 strands, but if you weave together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing with 2 strands and you let go, that braid is just going to unravel. In order to make that a strong relationship and make that successful, you need to interweave research in a good way. So I think by taking this approach that's been identified by our communities to braid together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, if researchers, academics, anyone in general who's engaging this type of work does it in a respectful manner that equally values ways of knowing, I think that great partnerships can be built for co-monitoring, co-research, co-management. And just to end off, just to talk about frameworks for partnership and things to consider. This is a 2-row wampum, which is a 500-year-old treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And these 2 purple lines here represent 2 vessels. So one being the Haudenosaunee, one being the Dutch. And they're traveling along a river, these 3 white lines representing peace, empowerment, and equity. Traveling along the river side by side, respecting one another, not interfering into the affairs of one another, but being there to help each other and complement one another for the greater good of the river. And we can think in terms of the environment, climate change in general. So yeah, that's what I have for today. Chimigwich. Thank you very much for listening.